Thanks, everyone. I think we'll get started. It's 1:31. I know we're expecting a bunch of other folks. I see about 40 so far, and we had just over 90 pre-registrants. So we'll get started, and those folks will join us as we go. Good morning, good afternoon, depending upon where you're located. My name is Gabe Most. I'm the Chief Experience Officer at JCC Association. I'm heading into my third month as of about a day or two ago in that position. So I haven't had the pleasure of meeting most of you yet, but I do look forward to that when we're able to do that in person, certainly. A word or two about the format of today's call. In a moment, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Mark Horowitz, who you probably already know is the vice president at JCC Association and the director of the Sheva Center for Innovation in Early Childhood, Jewish Education and Engagement. He'll share some opening remarks. After that, we're going to call upon two colleagues at JCC's. The first is Danielle Ellman. She is the exec in Common Point, Queens, here in New York City. And the second is Michael Rawl, the exec at the JCC in Youngstown, Ohio. Both Danielle and Michael have begun emergency early childcare, and we're going to ask them both to address the following main areas, after which we'll take some questions. We're going to ask them about the impetus prompt that got them started, when they actually began, so how long they've been going now, the scope of their operations, including who's eligible. Is it just folks that were part of their early childhood program before, just folks that are part of some emergency order essential services, or maybe a combination, how they're staffing, how they've handled and thought about liability and safety questions, and what they're sort of thinking about moving forward. And I'm seeing some nods, so hopefully that captured a number of the questions that you have already, and if not, we'll continue in Q&A. In terms of questions, whether they are for Danielle or for Michael, please chat your questions to Mark Horowitz. He should appear on the top of your list of participants there as a host. Chat your questions to Mark, and he will actually pose them out loud to Danielle and to Michael. And the second item is that if you, we're keenly aware that some of you are also well along into providing childcare, emergency childcare, and if you have something you'd like to contribute to the conversation, you think you have a model or a strategy that would be helpful, please let Mark know in the chat directly to him, and to the extent that we can include you, we'd love to do that. So with that, I'll turn things over to Mark, and before I do that, just ask folks to mute if you haven't already. That would be appreciated. Thanks.
It's nice to see you all here, and it's great to be together in the many ways that we're doing that. It was important for me to start today with a little bit of framing. And for those of you who have worked with us for a very long time, these Jewish lenses will sound familiar to you, but it felt like the way we needed to begin this afternoon. And so I quote mostly from the work that we're all doing together, which is that the Jewish imperative for involvement in the healing and unification of a broken world is an ancient one. It's only in modern times, however, that we have begun to associate the responsibility with a Hebrew phrase that we call tikkun olam, literally reparation of the universe. We live, obviously, in a fragmented world, and it is our nature to be somewhat dissatisfied with the acceptance of the way things are. We speak, and we yearn for a time of increased harmony, unity, synthesis, and partnership with others, as we are doing today. Judaism places an enormous and unique emphasis on our role in bringing about this redemption of the world. We are reminded in myriads of ways every day what it is to be alien, to be homeless, to be orphaned, oppressed, and how that gives rise to our commandment to see that others do not suffer the same fate as we once did when we were strangers in the land, enslaved in Egypt. As we come up to Passover, we remember this out loud, and we will be saying it over and over again. Our responsibility extends from the environment to interpersonal ethics, from political action to small everyday kindnesses, and to devastating times as we are in right now, like pandemics. What we do matters not only in our lives today, but in the lives of all generations to follow, and the decisions we make today will affect the generations to follow. The expectation is that we care for the homeless and the hungry and the stranger. It's motivated by our own knowledge of what it feels like to be broken. We have been enslaved, we have wandered, we have felt abandoned. And in place of resentment and anger, Judaism demands of us a generosity, and it demands social action. Just as God, according to our tradition, clothed the naked, visited the sick, and buried the dead, so should we all. Deuteronomy chapter 15 reminds us that if there is a needy person among you, one of your kin within your gates in your land that God gives you, do not harden your heart and give him enough resources for whatever he is lacking. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and God saved you, and therefore I command this of you today. This is one of dozens of places in the Torah that reminds us that we must be mindful of the needs of the stranger and of our communities, as we were strangers in this community and land of Egypt. So we gather here today to share and to do what JCC Association does best, to make connections, to bring you together, to hear each other, and to use the expertise of our field to make a difference with each and every one of us. That's our role. That's why we're here. And today we're here to talk about shifting to emergency childcare provision, a very complex issue with many, many, many issues on the table. And what we hope is that we'll be able to reveal to you what some people have done, what other people are trying to do, and that you'll be able to ask questions so that you can share in the world of saving, repairing, and tikkun olam. And so I turn the screen over to Danielle.
Hi, everybody. I hope that everybody's healthy and safe and doing the best that they can in these really crazy, crazy times. Happy to discuss emergency childcare and hope that some of the things that we did here potentially are replicatable, with the one probably enormous caveat that New York in general, in New York City as a government entity, has always been a significant funder in the not-for-profit space. And so to just give you a sense of that, like, you know, my current approved board budget was a little shy of $41 million, and government makes up about 18 million of that already. So I am a significantly funded government agency, and that obviously also allows for some relationships in general. When COVID started to hit New York, it really hit in the Orthodox community first, in our day school community. And in that fortune, I sit on a board of one of the day schools here. I just saw what the prep and planning that the day schools were doing, and so probably had a week of extra time to start thinking about, well, what would this look like in our space? We happen to be honoring the CEO of Northwell, of one of the branches of Northwell, which is the hospital system here, one of the hospital branches of the system here. And I had lunch with her the week before, and we were just talking about needs, and she really mentioned, you know, kind of the surge and what they were talking about in her world. And we started to talk about, well, what would emergency childcare look like in general? Obviously, as the mayor announced his school is closing, there's and the city is coming to a halt, there's this recognition that there has to be some sort of support system in place for emergency childcare workers. So I basically, from the start of our shutdown on Sunday night, my one and primary goal, almost to the point of being like a gnat in everybody's ears, was to figure out how I get us up and running in emergency childcare while also trying to exist to the best of my abilities in the virtual space for our current preschool. So really two completely different populations, except where there is potential overlap. So what we did was, we have the state and the city, and if anybody's watching anything that's happening in New York, our governor and our mayor are never, ever on the same page about anything, which actually for us was an advantage and opportunity. So we applied, we figured out that with all of the licensing requirements, that if we actually shifted ourselves, and I don't know, obviously all of this varies state by state, to an emergency drop-in center versus a child care license, a lot of the regulations really changed. And what that nuance in New York means is that in an emergency childcare center, you cannot enroll a child. So that means that if I'm a healthcare worker, I have to register on a daily basis. I can't be registered for the month of April. I can't have a formalized enrollment. I can register on Monday that I'm going to need your services Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but I can't be enrolled. It can't be considered enrollment in the program. And so in the fee-for-service world, that means that you're essentially coming up with a daily rate for your services as opposed to a weekly rate or a monthly rate, and it changes for the positive. The regulations in New York on who can run those programs and what types of certifications you need. So when you become an emergency drop-in center, you're no longer living in the realm of an obligation. I mean, this sounds terrible, but an obligation to educate children. You're now sitting in a realm of an object to care for children. And so how you use staff and who you use becomes very different. And in New York was really about clearances. So the one, New York City, not the state, the one parameter is that you still have to have what we call cleared to work with children staff. So as that's happening, I'm also pivoting to the city. We happen to run something here called community schools where we coexist in struggling New York City schools to do the mental health, blah, blah, blah services in those schools. You don't care about any of that. So I started really hitting up the Office of Community Schools to say, what are you guys doing? What are these RECs that de Blasio is talking about? How do I get involved? So probably not surprising to any of you, but there wasn't a rush or a demand for people to, so DOE, the idea was you have the teachers in the Department of Education doing virtual distance learning, but then you have within the Department of Education, very similar concept, all the support staff, paraprofessionals, education associates, aides, certain admin positions that are essentially effectively the part-time staff of the Department of Education. They are not receiving pay right now, or that's not 100% clear. So the thought was that staff would then supply the need for these REC centers. Shockingly, not shockingly, I'm being sarcastic, that didn't happen. So now the city essentially has 10,000 jobs and they don't have the people to run them. So we took on 6 RECs for them, so we took on 6 RECs for them. And again, with really the only requirement being that our staff had to be cleared to run them. The city then realizes, oh crap, in these public schools, we can't have preschool students, because originally my instinct in reaching out to the community schools was really about our site-based services that I wanted to become an REC. I wanted my agency to be an REC. So initially the city said, no way, you can't be an REC. Those are going to be limited to the DOE. Long story short, they realize they don't have preschool spots. They now start through a different office in the Department of Education, their preschool offices, which is where we have our pre-K contracts, to start to pivot for provision there too. So again, being annoying, I was ahead of the game, and all of that licensure got approved really quickly. So I now have all of my preschool centers are operating as RECs, which is 3, plus these 6. So I have 9 centers. Before we shut our buildings down, I had 1,209 employees. We converted a significant part of our labor force to the virtual space. We run mental health through the virtual space. We're running our school, like some of our school programs, to the virtual space. So I have 113 full-time employees that moved to the virtual space. So I got on a town hall with my staff on Friday thinking that like I was the savior because I didn't have to do layoffs. I actually had enough jobs for everybody, and basically was able to take, like, if you're my aquatics director, you can actually be a supervisor in one of my RECs. As long as you're cleared for working with children, I'm allowed to really pivot you, which basically means, because just as our hiring practice, we clear people because there's always cross-pollination with children. We basically had our entire labor force eligible for these centers. Shockingly, I muted the chat. I don't think people realize that I knew who was asking the questions, but I was getting like essentially almost death threats through this chat group in my town hall. Like, how could you risk our lives? You only care about money. You only care about, you know, basically like you're asking me to choose between my livelihood and my job. This is crazy. This is ridiculous. Because I think for New York City in general, we're not used to being shut down. I think most of my employees were thinking of this almost like in snowstorm seasons where we tap into their sick banks and then we bring them back to work. And I don't think they really, and I still don't think, that they really have a pulse on how many people are being laid off across the city right now. And the numbers are enormous. And obviously a lot of colleagues have shared what's going on with them. And so essentially at the end of that town hall, they were really given three choices: that they either had a function in the agency that could be approved in the virtual space, that they were taking one of these reassignments, or that they were helping, they were connecting with HR to explore their options for leave. As of Monday, I had one resignation, which was actually a facilities resignation. So one of my facilities is not operating. We reassigned to another facility. The person just flat out refused. But in terms of my staff, there are definitely people that I have a target on my back and are not happy with me. But essentially, we reassigned almost my entire labor force with the exception of, the number was 12 this morning that are essentially going on leave because of either immunity compromised health conditions or things like that. In terms of how these RECs run, we were also able to, whether on our staff or through the DOE, have essentially medical professionals that are at the doors of these sites. So temperature is taken upon arrival. If you have a temperature of 100.4, you cannot enter for the day. We have not had that happen yet. The REC attendance is terrible. That we're not operating at anywhere near our capacities yet. We probably have the capacity to do 1,500 kids a day. We're probably operating at about 150 kids a day. What's really interesting is because the system went really quickly, you take a slot from us, right? Then you take it in its entirety. Very counterintuitive how you might do after school, where if somebody's registered for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're going to sell the Tuesday, Thursday slot. The way the city has asked us to do it is just take the slot in its entirety because you don't know about overtime and shifts like that. So I think based on New York healthcare practice, which tends to be a 12-hour shift 3 days a week, it just, you're never going to have 100% attendance based on how they asked you to set up your enrollment with what the realities of healthcare workers are. So we're doing social distancing. No room can have more than 9 kids. We're keeping the same groups of kids moving together within the building. We actually have so much square footage because our numbers are so low that we actually are only using one half of the building so that if, God forbid, we have a positive case, we can actually shift them to the other half of the building. The way New York City is moving, which I think is different than everywhere else, they're no longer shutting you down if you have a positive case. You just have to quarantine anybody who has a temperature or is appearing ill. You then close your center down that night. You verify that you did a deep cleaning and you can open up the next morning. It really, in that sense, is kind of wartime scenario because I think they recognize that they need the service of the critical care. And at the rate that things are spreading in New York in general, that there's no way to kind of isolate that a positive case actually is connected to your facility anymore. So we keep a nurse on site. We have a designated room for anybody who is ill. We were asked to provide meals. We also got, I mean, this is just a silly nuance, but right now, if you're in the 5 boroughs, the city is paying for those slots. So we have licensure to also be in the state, accept state workers. And what that means is if you live in Long Island or you live in Westchester, you're not a part of the 5 boroughs in its purest form. So we can accept you under our secondary license and we're charging you a fee for service. As long as we're not co-populating in terms of how we build a city, that's acceptable right now as well. So that is a very long very long explanation of what we're doing. I hope it was thorough and not too long. And it actually allowed me to retain my labor force for the short run.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I can't imagine there won't be many questions, but we're going to ask Michael, if we can, if I can find him, to continue with his story.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. That was a great start. Okay, I've got some prompts here. How did we begin? How did we know we were going to begin? We saw the writing on the wall, and of course, we have a lot of very concerned people here. And in an effort to be prepared, we had been talking about this a week and a half before we closed the building. We closed on the 15th, and we knew all along that we were going to have to provide childcare for our other Federation agencies. On our campus, we also have a nursing home and an assisted living home, obviously, and JFS, and those facilities were not going to shut down, and those people still needed childcare. We also have a number of motivations that I'm sure are similar to everyone else here, which includes this is mission work, that we want to retain and engage our staff long-term and take care of them, that we want to also, I see it as an opportunity to ultimately diversify our donor base. We're in a community that is shrinking massively, and it's really an existential issue when it comes to annual campaigns. And so the idea of having a clear community support that can later be leveraged or currently in some form of campaign, I think is a smart long-term strategy. But of course, it's not the only reason. It's just one of the pieces that we're being cognizant of. So as we were trying to assess all of that and knowing we were going to have to provide some level of childcare anyway, we began to compile as much information we could about doing this in this new environment. We couldn't get any guidance from any officials of any kind, which is probably a similar experience everyone's having. They're very busy, and they also didn't know themselves. So we began pretty regular phone calls with both of our attorneys, one of which is our general counsel, the other one is our labor attorney, and we asked both of them the same questions every time. Questions about liability, questions about how to run the program, if the state shuts down our regular license, et cetera, how to bring in more employees if our credentialed employees are unable to for whatever reason. Questions like, we have a day school in our building that's under Department of Education, while our early childhood is under the Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services, run by the county. And so different credentialing. And the question was, well, if I have Department of Education teachers that want to work for me, and there's no, what do I do there? And in most cases, the attorneys really told us that if we act in good faith and we compile reasonable credentials, if I keep a folder of information, for example, my wife is a special needs preschool teacher, but she works for Department of Education. And, if I compiled her certifications into a folder and had a narrative about why I reasonably believed that it was appropriate that she was with our children, that both of the lawyers felt very comfortable with that. Now, fortunately, as time went on, we ultimately did get some guidance. But to be clear, we were planning to move forward even in the absence of a temporary childcare pandemic license, which is a title of a thing I never thought I would see. So as I'm saying is we were prepared to do that before there was even such a thing as the license. Then we very quickly, I believe it was last week on Tuesday, they announced the license. We submitted the application within 45 minutes probably. And then on Friday of the same week, we received notice that we had received the license. We're licensed for, I believe, 203 children, including 53 children under the age of 2.5. That's slightly more than our regular license. Some of the complications that they have now invoked are that the group size is a maximum of 6. And so in some cases, of course, we have 1 to 6 classrooms. In an infant classroom, we'd have a 2 to 6 ratio. That is not good for business, but that's the guideline. And they've also, our process is a little simpler, it sounds like, than New York. You know, in the normal environment, we receive roughly half of our revenue from county subsidies, from low-income families who qualify with the county, and about half our revenue comes from the county. In this new program, the Pandemic Childcare Program, the system is mirrored, so it's very easy for us to manage. They have increased the reimbursement rates, though, by about 30% or so a month. That certainly helps offset the costs. But since we're not actually running at full capacity, we're certainly going to continue to be operating at a deficit. What we've learned is that the number of kids every day is fluctuating, not only from our own agencies, but from outside groups. You know, some of the outside groups, we also learned, you know, we've been talking to Mercy Health, our local healthcare provider that has 6,000 employees in the Valley. At first, we thought we were going to exclusively partner with them because they would have more need than we could handle. Well, we started to learn over time that these organizations are moving very, very slowly on these topics. Either it's not a priority compared to the other priorities, or they don't know what to do, or I'm not really sure. And so they really were stalling us for 2 weeks. And so we began to open up our program. We have now invited any first responder. We contacted a number of other assisted living centers and nursing homes in our region. And the protocols in our building are actually, they're fairly complicated. We're aware that if there's an infected case or some level of contamination, that it may require us to close down the program. So we're fortunate to have an expansive building. It's about 100,000 square feet here. And currently the preschool wing and the infant and toddler wing are already at opposite sides of the building. Then we have our day school wing, which is on a different side of the building yet. And of course, we have a bunch of other empty rooms. We have now implemented protocols that each of the classrooms is to be entirely isolated. We've given them all radios. They will soon all have laptops as well. I mean, most of them already did. And they are going to have a schedule where their classrooms will only be leaving one at a time. They can use the facilities in the building on the appropriate schedule. They'll be using the bathrooms one at a time, you know, if you can control that with children. And then we have the custodial crew coordinated with that as well, and they're coming in between them and cleaning between each group. So what we're prepared for is what seems to be the inevitability that somebody within our program is going to be infected. And then at that time, we will only have to close down one classroom, which is a group of 6. And then the others will continue to operate until we clean that room and then resume operations. So it's a little complicated, but you know, with all of this work we're investing into it, you know, it seems that next week we could have a case in our program and have to shut the whole thing down, and then it would seem, you know, that it was futile. For staffing, we are, first off, of course, we're using our ELC professionals. I would say that almost half of them have attempted to opt out in one way or another because they have immunocompromised people at home or whatever their stories may be. So then we've continued to identify other staff, similar to Danielle. You know, we know, for example, that our swim instructors, you know, all have the appropriate certifications to be in classrooms with children and to be part of the ratio. Now, that's taken a bit of planning on our part because those are the employees who are first ultimately to get the message that they're going to be laid off. We actually haven't laid anybody off yet. We've been continuing to pay everybody since the 15th. And we were set to send out a memo that employees under 20 hours were going to be laid off starting on the end of the pay period on the 5th. However, we've actually had to hold that memo for a few days because there are a whole host of other concerns. One is we're very cognizant that the messaging may be confusing. We may need you to work in the early childhood, but then you're going to get this blanket statement that says that if you were under 20 hours, you're laid off. And so, you know, how do we communicate individually with each of these people while still sending this communication. It's a little complicated. The second thing that's really, we're hoping we're going to get some answers today, is that we're very much afraid that we're going to be competing with unemployment. Obviously there's many reasons why an employee would want to stay engaged, health insurance, assurance they're going to have a job when they get back, et cetera, et cetera. But many people, and many people that may be not very sophisticated, are going to get the news about the new stimulus package, and they're going to be listening to analysis 24/7 on the news, and they may cultivate the opinion that it's better for them to stay home, and it may be financially better. I mean, some of the rumors we're hearing make that a difficult situation. So we've actually had to put a hold on the memo until we're clear about exactly what we're communicating and what we're communicating, who we're communicating with. We then, of course, have identified the rest of our staff who are eligible, which includes a lot of supervisors and full-time people, because we require them to be certified to work with children. We also have the benefit that we have a background checking machine in-house. We have enough employees that has been well worth the investment, not having to wait 30 days for the state to get back to us. So if anyone has that capability, that really makes life a whole lot easier to get new people on board. I probably have more things to say, but I'm not sure off the top of my head, so I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Michael. That's really helpful. I'm going to ask you, please, if you have questions. I have one question here, but if you have questions, please send them to me so I can't imagine you don't have questions. I have 40 of them. Please put them in the chat. And while you're thinking about your questions and writing them to me, I would like to ask you to do the following. We are wondering if you could show us with a show of silent hands. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you see that you can raise your hand. And we wonder if you would raise your hand electronically so we could see the number of you who are considering really thinking about doing this in your center. If you're really beginning to think about being a home for emergency workers, that would be interesting for us. So if you can do that, we can check that out. And if you have questions, please send them to me and I will send them along and we'll ask. And also, if you have something that you would like to share, please, that you are in the midst of. I know there are some of you on the screen who are either about to start doing this or have started, I know, even today. So I'd be happy to hear from you if you want to let me know you'd like to speak, but I don't want to just call on you. So my first question that I have for the two of you or either of you are the difference in pay between those who are staying home and working and those who are working at the center, the educators. So I wonder if you would, and you can unmute yourselves.
For us, this has been an ongoing debate. I think that it's very clear that we need to pay them additional money to do this task. I'm not getting consensus from our volunteer leadership, who seems to be continuing with this attitude that they should be happy to have a job. This is one of the reasons that we've put a hold on the memo, because that attitude isn't going to get us real far when unemployment is a viable option. Of course, we're hearing regionally, which I'm sure is probably the case for everyone else, that the local bank tellers at 4 local bank branches are getting $2 an hour extra, and they're behind pneumatic tubes. The local grocery stores are getting hazard pay. And meanwhile, we have the children of healthcare workers who are being crawled on by the children all day. And I think that it's very clear that they should, but for us, it hasn't been that easy. And Mark, if I also, off the topic of that question, I wanted to mention that we found several other ways in which to generate revenue. There is a huge demand right now for frozen meals. We had to move Meals on Wheels out of the nursing home because it's non-essential for the nursing home, but of course it's essential for the people who are receiving them. So we're operating that at the JCC. This morning, we were on a call where, because of the crisis situation, we're allowed to enroll our own people into their frozen meal program, and their only qualification has to be that they're over 60 years old. And then we'll receive a reimbursement for kosher meals of almost $10 a meal. So that is a real viable thing that we're getting rolling as well.
Thank you, Michael. Danielle, do you have something to add there?
It's really interesting, and we've talked about, I mean, right now, what we were able to do, which isn't 100% equitable, is basically whatever you make, if you shift over to these emergency childcare centers, you're making that salary, and that's kind of the rate in which we charged it out at. A lot of talk about hazard pay and how you do that, but right now, very similar to Michael, nobody is giving, on the state regulatory level, they are not allowing us to do that. So that would be a complete, that would be something we have to completely take on our own. My suspicion is that we're going to start to look into some sort of bonus strategy, where we bonus people at the end of something for however many days they did, so that we can do something to say thank you. I think because of the minute-by-minute news on this and a lot of just confusing misinformation, I think people think that there's lots of similar, like, unemployment just benefits coming their way that do not make it necessarily worthwhile. And what's really interesting in New York, at least, is when the news talks about essential workers, they never mention childcare, which I think speaks to this whole issue of why we can't get any traction. So the grocery workers are mentioned, the MTA is mentioned, essential sanitation is mentioned, but I've never watched the news where anybody talks about essential childcare workers, which I think is part of the narrative of why there isn't the ability to move this. We are allowed to play, again, for the things that are being reimbursed to us, we are allowed to play time and a half if people go into overtime scenarios and things like that, which, you know, might happen, but beyond that, no. And similar to Michael, our agency that Monday shifted really into almost like a disaster social service agency. So we're doing a lot in the food space. We're doing home delivery. It's keeping my drivers working. It's keeping my facilities people working. We were able to get Medicare, Medicaid, and our insurance companies to approve teletherapeutic services. So we're now working on asking for volunteers to donate devices, because our only limitation is where we can't bill is where our older adults who are isolated just don't have access to cameras because they won't approve phone conversations. So there are certain parts of the agency that are actually still operating based on kind of pivoting and pausing on what is our typical business and saying, okay, what are the community needs now? How can we be responsive? And then how can we go after money for it? And we've been really successful in food, mental health, and emergency childcare.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. And this is a moment for a commercial that I think is really important, and a silver lining that we all need to think about coming out of this, which is the notion of the importance in the professional lives of early childhood educators. We are working, as we speak, continue to work with the Union for Reform Judaism on a number of areas in how we can think about the world looking at our educators in a very different light, make a difference in the way that people see their worth. And I think that many of our families and many of our people will be more receptive to that kind of advocacy as we move through this. A question about liability. What about the liability of the increased risk of people who are contracting the virus, and how are their healthcare costs affected?
Our attorneys, and this goes before we had a pandemic license, our attorneys had virtually no concern about liability. They said that if this is the function that we're doing, these are emergency times, our workers do need childcare support, that was it. Both of them didn't hesitate on that issue.
Danielle, you're shaking your head, so.
So basically the same, plus in New York, once they stopped kind of tracing the root of how people contracted, then it also became not only A, but then B, which is that you can't even trace back that you were contaminated by being in our agency. So between those two issues, it kind of is not an issue beyond the PR of it, which is that your staff feel totally differently about that. And that's, that has been the hardest part of this for us.
So another question is, have you either of you thought about, or is there thinking about how this might be applicable to camp when we move into summer? It's an interesting question. Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, again, despite having the ability to do this in multiple sites, despite the fact that the DOE is paying for a significant portion of this, so it's not even that I'm selling these services, I'm essentially getting funded for them. We would obviously keep this going as long as we were in this status, but it would never, I don't want to at all misrepresent that it would replace the revenue that I would lose if my 4-day camps and 1 sleepaway camp don't open.
Yeah, I can't say that we have a specific solution for camp, but you know, a number of our employees who are not engaged in this program are still being paid, and so certainly we've found plenty of work for them to do. And some of those tasks include imagining what our JCC looks like if we open in this environment. And I don't mean because we're planning to open tomorrow, but I mean because it seems inevitable that there are going to be cases around for a whole long time in this country, and that we may be operating under a new normal, and that shouldn't be a surprise for us. And so we're trying to consider that in everything we do, fitness and how to use the elevator and all that stuff.
So along those lines, if an educator tests positive, do they get paid sick time for the 14-day quarantine?
Currently, our policy is just like any other time. They have PTO time, which includes sick pay, and certainly they could be on FMLA.
Same.
Great. Thank you. I want to just let you all know as well, I heard from Matt Abrams-Gerber, and I knew this, in Riverdale, the Riverdale Y is beginning this program tomorrow, their version of what they're doing tomorrow. So I imagine he'll have a great deal of wisdom to share with you as he moves along. Another question is, are you trying to keep staff consistent to minimize the number of people exposed, or are you trying to spread out hours between people?
We have made the teachers are assigned to their own room. They're not even to come out and fraternize with the other teachers once they've been assigned to a room. We won't be mixing them between rooms. And in fact, to the best of our ability, we're keeping employers isolated. And we're certainly isolating the difference between, say, Mercy Health, our level 1 trauma center, who is in the thick of it, and people like our assisted living home workers. And so we're keeping them isolated. And within all of those different isolations, which become burdensome for the number of staff we need, you know, we're definitely keeping our own nursing home and assisted living home agency staff in their own section. Fortunately, we have lots of doors that open to the outside. And so people aren't even coming through a shared door. They're being assigned one way into the building, one bathroom, etc.
Danielle, do you have something to in that too? Okay. Another question is, what about the protocols of dropping off and picking up? Curbside, not curbside. What are you doing about that?
So we've been asked that for our preschool families, we allow for some separation. We allow the parents into the building. They do a temperature scan as well and kind of walk the child to the classroom, because remember, like a 2-3-year-old who's never been in your building and is just getting dropped off. Otherwise, we have 6 feet. We have social distancing as a part of drop-off, which is super complicated, where people sign in versus where the child is received. And we're limiting access to the facility of kind of school-age children's parents. It's not perfect, but that's kind of, as we see it, the best way forward to kind of still, you know, recognize that we need to be warm and welcoming, and that our 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, this is probably very scary for them if they're not going to their normal preschool setting. But otherwise, not really allowing parents into the building. We have a vestibule and they don't go past that area.
We're doing something similar. We have protocols because we do have a number of staff that are in the building right now, including some construction that's continuing because that's also an essential service, and we're in the middle of some construction. And everybody who comes or goes from the building is logged, and we're following protocols where we're scanning their temperatures. We are also scanning the children and their parents, and we have had assurances, you know, in every case so far, we've gotten to the parents through their employer, which has been beneficial because not only has the employer spread the word about us, but the employer is assuring us that they also are monitoring their employee, the parent. And in some cases, we've been short on electric thermometers. And so we've required our partners, who are medical providers, to give us one so that we could help their families.
This is fascinating. I have a question that I've been wondering about as well. What are the families who are regularly enrolled in your school and who are not attending at the moment? What are they thinking? Are you hearing from them? Do you imagine any feedback? Have you gotten feedback?
So we actually proactively reached out to all of our after school and preschool families with kind of our policy related to what we were doing with their current tuition dollars, freeze, blah, blah, whatever position we had taken in that area, and then notified them of this and the link to register and kind of the qualifiers that we saw. I haven't had this happen yet, but the thought is that if somebody has a monthly payment in our after school program and wants to make use of emergency childcare, and the city, and they're not in a 5-bar, and that would become a fee for service, that we would then start to credit that money from their account into this service, so that in kind of good faith, we don't look like we're charging them double in the same time period. It hasn't happened yet, but that's what we're thinking in our heads.
We utilized our parents who were healthcare workers to help us get to their employers, which was the source of some of the children. Other than that, people who aren't engaged at all, they're at home, and we've been utilizing our teachers up to this point, to do video circle time and story reading and the things that probably everybody else is doing. I'm not sure how long they'll continue as our capacity, as the number of children enrolled currently grows. Also, one other thing we've had to come across that I've never had to deal with is the potential for providing evening, weekend, and the possibility of overnight care. Fortunately, we have no one who requested overnight care yet, but we are providing care until 10:30 p.m. and on weekends. That's just something we've never had to do before.
Wow. Here's a very thoughtful question from clearly an early childhood educator, and I imagine the answer. So we spend a lot of time when we're working with children throughout the year in knowing who they are and knowing if they have any particular issues or special education needs, and what there is about them that we need to know. Is there any way, does any of that happen? Is there any intake? Is there anything that the parents come with to you in order for the teachers to be able to do their very best work?
Yes, I mean, it's not as thorough as a teacher who lives and breathes with students in a classroom, but we have kind of an orientation packet that does give us basics. We have we require a medical. We also have kind of like allergy, like if there's allergies, some special forms to fill out. So again, trying our best to balance with this idea of like rapid, and it's happening for a finite period of time, with how do we provide the best quality of service possible for our school-age children. There's distance learning, so our role is that our staff members will be doing what is the educational content that their schools are providing them, that we're supporting those students in that educational process in the same way a parent in the house would be doing. I mean, same way, probably plus or minus depending on the parent, right? To really support that child in their educational endeavors, and for our preschool children have basically what would be like a preschool day in a much smaller scenario, and with less, very similar to Michael, that there's really no integration at all. There's no kind of cross collaborations or group Oneg Shabbat or anything like that. You're really isolating each of these rooms.
Yeah, we of course we do the standard forms, intake forms. I do have some concern, about the quality of relationships that are being developed. The kids aren't on a necessarily consistent schedule, and I really don't know what kind of trauma the teachers may be feeling about being exposed to these children who they may or may not see as germ carriers, and how that impacts their behavior. It's got to on some level. But I don't really know what that looks like. Also, Daron, I think I want some extra credit for this. I know we all at MIFGOSH we're learning about leadership and preparing yourself by building an infrastructure for troubling times. And I think that this is a great example where we've been successful, which is that we have some very strong partnerships in our community, and it's those partnerships that got us off the ground so quickly. Our strong relationship with the United Way connected us to not only students who were in need, but when one of those agencies said, well, gee, we have special needs children, can you help them? And our normal answer is no, we don't have a special needs program. The United Way immediately connected us to another United Way partner who runs special needs schools. And the United Way said, we're going to pay the salary for specialized instructors to come in and take care of these kids, because we think that that's an important priority. So now we have special needs children in our program that we would have never had before. And we have these teachers in our building that would have never been here before, and we're not even paying their salary. So it's a great example that you can really be creative to how you solve these problems.
Wow. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'd love to ask you, Danielle, and you, Michael, for just a sort of closing statement, something you'd like us to know that nobody's asked. This last question is about food. How are you feeding, and what arrangements do you make for food in your new childcare experience?
So we're catering in 3 meals, 2 breakfast, lunch, and snack. We're doing kind of emergency childcare that works for that hospital worker who's on a 7 to 7 shift. So we're open at 6:30, we close at 7:30. Again, the demand is not there yet for dinner, but the idea is that if we had to add a dinner meal, we would. Everything is individually wrapped. Everything is in ones, right? So your utensils are like nothing where our staff is touching anything. It's all wrapped and handed out, and as age appropriate and friendly as possible. And then we'll, during Passover, we'll be closed for the first days, but maybe not the last days, because the city, there's a lot of negotiations going on, but we'll turn to a kosher for Passover, and everything we're giving out is glatt kosher, no matter what the needs of the kids are. And gluten-free and out, but meaning we're going with the highest to serve the most.
Great.
Currently, we're operating as we had previously, which is that children need to pack their own lunches and we provide snack. However, we're finding some potential synergy, we're hoping, with the Meals on Wheels program. Previously, the program being operated out of the nursing home was really just them packaging their leftovers, because they're making a lot of meals for the nursing home, and they were delivering something like 250 meals a week. Next week, we're looking at beginning to create 500 meals a day, and we're hoping to be able to leverage the kitchen staff and the extra food, and we're looking for funding to be able to just provide that to the children. In fact, let me also say that we've learned a lot about emergency funding. I know everybody here is probably at a different stage of the crisis, but what we learned is that very, very quickly there were groups like the United Way and the Mercy Health Foundation and other community groups who were immediately handing out funds, almost no questions asked, to people that they trusted, because they knew that people needed to transition to a new normal. Almost all of those people then, at that time, stated that that was their intent, to get to the new normal, and that in about a month, they were then going to have procedures in place where people could ask, and it could be vetted, and on and on and on. And so our main concern here was getting the ask in instantly, so we could have some of that unfettered, really not very well vetted money, because by the time another month rolls around, I can't control what their agenda might be. It might be political, it may be targets that don't have anything to do with us, it may be donor driven, I don't know. And so that would be one piece of advice, is that people try to engage with their local fundraising community very quickly. And then people have probably also been hearing that there are a number of foundations that are allowing people to unrestrict funds from grants that they've received, and that in most cases you really it's on us to ask. In fact, right now, we received $125,000 from some local health foundations, and we intend to install an ice skating rink this winter. Well, you can imagine in the scheme of things, I don't care too much about ice skating rinks right now. And we've put in an ask. It's a group of 3 different organizations. We've asked all 3 of them if we can unrestrict the funds. We haven't heard back yet, but that's the kind of thing that our idle staff is spending their time on.
I cannot imagine a more valuable, open and honest and generous conversation than what we have just heard. And we're also grateful. And before I turn this back to Gabe, I wonder if either of you have something else to say before we close. Danielle?
Or, I think, again, like, this is such uncharted waters, and nobody knows really when this will end. That I'm happy to be a thought partner with anybody on pivoting any of your staff and services into kind of these buckets that we've been able to kind of keep ourselves floating while we are all taking it on the chin in our fee-for-services. So if I can be helpful in how we're doing mental health and how we're getting approvals or things like that, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to be a resource. And if anybody has ideas around that space that they want to share, I think those are really helpful ideas as we're all kind of navigating this kind of unknown timeline.
Ditto, please. I put my email in the chat. You can have my cell phone, whatever you need. I'm happy to talk about it. I think it's a 2-way street. I'm trying to gather ideas from everybody as well. It's very fluid.
I just have to, one more time, just say thank you to Danielle and to Michael for taking the time in the midst of what is happening in your centers, for being so thorough and so thoughtful, and for opening yourselves up. If you need to find either of them and you didn't write it down in the chat, you know how to get hold of all of us and what we can do. And I'm going to turn this over to Gabe in case he wants to tell you anything about what's coming up in the world.
Thanks, Mark. I join your thanks to Danielle and to Michael and all of you for being with us, and extend myself also. Please be in touch if I can be helpful. And Mark, thank you for the part you played as well. I don't have announcements about further elements. So with that, unless there's something pending in the chat, we'll thank all of you, and we'll see you virtually, and wish you all strength and good health, and that we see each other in person as soon as we can.